When you went to China, did you ever say, I'm going home to China? Black Americans always say,
Sure.
going home to Africa. They ain't been to Africa, they can't speak African languages, but when they say home, in a certain way, you know they're talking about the continent.
Sure.
Most of them spend the first night crying and trying to get to Hilton and then trying to get back home
Yeah.
to the United States. But did you feel like you were going home to China when you first went back to China?
Well, what's interesting is, having grown up essentially in Paris, New York, with Chinese parents, the obvious differences when visiting Asia. So China was not the first Asian country or place that I visited. It was Japan, and then it was Hong Kong or Taiwan or South Korea and whatever. So basically, the visual difference is everybody has black hair.
Right.
Suddenly, so instead of, you go from being a minority in one sense to part of a majority population. And so that's a huge thing. I think in terms of habits, I think one of the things that joins a lot of Asian cultures, well, there are a number of things. One of them is the idea of Confucianism, hierarchy, a way of behaving that is supposedly legislated in such a way to minimize conflict. So less of a dialogue kind of society, dialogue-driven society, but one where the response is expected. And so I think, so in a funny way, by going to Japan first, I could see, certain of the unspoken values expressed in a society that my parents talked about or tried to create in the family environment. Suddenly I see it expressed in a larger, intact society and practiced in a way that I thought, gee, even though I don't speak the language, I think I understand the behavior patterns. So there are different kinds of recognition factors that create home. But maybe I'm not answering your question about in terms of the primal home. In a very odd way, I took a course in anthropology in college, and one of the I loved anthropology as a field because it actually could explain the behaviors and the value systems of the different cultures that I had met and experienced. And one of the cultures we studied was the Bushmen, or the San people, or the Wasi people from the Kalahari Desert, and we studied them in text, through books, through films that the Marshall family collected in the 50s, and there was a film called Bitter Melons, story of a blind musician, and I was fascinated. In fact, I was just kind of obsessed with that film because this blind musician played music that was incredibly magical. And as a 19-year-old, I did what many 19-year-olds do, which is one day I'm going to go there. And 15 years later, I actually went there and went to Namibia and did a documentary on. I went to a number of villages and interviewed people and whatever. That was one of the turning points in my life in looking at people, cultures, why people do what they do. It was the furthest I had ever gone from what I knew. And we had already had 2 children, so it was scary because I didn't know exactly where I was going, even though I'd made a lot of attempts to understand. And that was, to me, in some ways, the closest to home that I have ever experienced. Because before we became agricultural, we were all hunter-gatherers, and that was the way everybody lived. We lived lightly on the land. We had to. right? And it was
we
a
were light
way.
on our feet.
Exactly,
because we had to be.
and exactly, and it was an image that I could hold on to, that I knew that we all shared in common, and the practices of the Bushmen that I loved so much was that being essentially a very peaceful group of people, and they had a way of interacting, a way of doing, going into trance dance for healing purposes, that combined their medicine, their religion, their culture, and they did it whenever they needed to, and they were generous about sharing it. And so everything that I had studied in music, in terms of, great works of art, whatever, all of those elements were there in their trance dance practice.
It's like the fundamental ethos of their culture.
Absolutely.
It's amazing.
And that's, and that to me, to this day, I hold on to as something that, to say, well, the impulse to heal, and for community, and for knowledge, and for sharing of knowledge, and timing of doing that that's something that is always in my mind.